A couple of years ago, whilst browsing the Genesis subreddit, I came across this Iceberg chart. The items on this chart range from stuff I already knew about, to stuff that was frequently debated on within the community, to stuff I couldn't even find information about elsewhere on the internet. But the thing that intrigued me most was this entry, 37 unused songs from 1969 to 1970. Initially, this might not seem too unusual. Most artists have at least a handful of songs left in the vault, and especially when an artist's career grows to be as long as the one Genesis had, it's not altogether too surprising to find that that number has become far more than just a handful by the end. However, Genesis is actually an exception to this rule, with very few songs having remained unreleased over the years. Part of this is by virtue of the way the band wrote their music. Most of Duke and Abacab's songs were written during jam sessions, and all the material from self-titled onwards was written that same way. It's true that this only really accounts for the back half of their career, but even during the Peter Gabriel era, when band members wrote songs independently or in smaller groups, rejected material was often reworked and recycled on later albums. As such, you can see why this 37 number initially shocked me. That being said, even within exceptions there are exceptions. During the band's formative years, that is, during Anthony Phillips' tenure as Genesis' guitarist, there were a solid handful of demos made for their often overlooked first album, From Genesis to Revelation, that were never recorded as complete songs. We know this because those demos were released as part of the retrospective release archive number 1. At the time the original post was made, no one in the comments had asked about the 37 songs, and though the OP said they would start working on a video, seemingly nothing came of it. With the post itself now inactive, it was up to me to reverse engineer the list of the 37 unused songs myself. While the demos in archive number 1 were technically recorded in 1968, they were intended for release on the band's 1969 debut, and they make up a significant chunk of songs, so I thought they were as good a place as any to start our list of 37. The demos for From Genesis to Revelation included on archive number 1 are as follows: Build Me a Mountain, Image Blown Out, The Magic of Time, Hey, Hidden in the World of Dawn, Mystery of the Flannan Isle Lighthouse, Hair on the Arms and Legs, She is Beautiful, Try a Little Sadness, and Patricia. It is worth noting that She is Beautiful and Patricia were later developed into The Serpent and In Hiding respectively, which were actually released on From Genesis to Revelation, but I didn't know what the person making the Iceberg chart considered unused, so I thought I might as well include them with the other demos. I at least had the restraint not to include the demos from Genesis to Revelation on archive number 1 that remained largely unchanged for the final album. While we're on the topic of Genesis' debut, I also wanted to mention Visions of Angels and Twilight Alehouse, which weren't included as demos on archive number 1, but were in the early stages of development during the From Genesis to Revelation sessions, and received full releases later in Genesis' career. You can actually hear a snippet of Twilight Alehouse during the instrumental interlude leading into The Serpent, but I digress. All that is just to say that I'm also counting them for my list. Visions of Angels technically did release during the 1969 to 1970 window, but for the sake of remaining consistent, we'll say that this early version is sufficiently different enough to count. As you can tell by the sheer number of cut tracks, Genesis easily had enough material from their debut to make a double album. On screen right now, you'll see how I would have formatted such a release. Here, I also included non-album singles A Winter's Tale, That's Me, and One-Eyed Hound. Re-releases of From Genesis to Revelation also tend to include a Silent Sun single version that's indexed separately from the album version, but as far as I can tell, the two sound the same. Anyway, you'll also note that the album's closer, A Place to Call My Own, features an extended track length from the version present on the final album. We'll get to that. Many would likely assert that it was for the best that From Genesis to Revelation wasn't released as a double, as the Genesis on display there is a far cry from anything the band would later release, but for what it's worth, the album has a real homegrown feel to it, which the poor production value somewhat ironically ends up enhancing. Plus, even on this first release, you can tell they had a real ear for melody. If you're a Genesis fan who's written this album off, I implore you to give it a second chance. The wealth of tracks left on the cutting room floor from Genesis' debut puts us at a whopping 12 out of 37. Yeah, like I said, there's a reason that 37 number jumped out to me as kind of spectacular. We aren't out of low-hanging fruit to grab though, so without further ado, let's move on to the Trespass outtakes. Much like From Genesis to Revelation before it, the writing sessions leading up to the recording of Trespass bore enough songs to produce a double album if Genesis so desired. The only difference is, whereas we seem to have gotten demos for most of the songs left off of From Genesis to Revelation on archive number 1, demos for Trespass outtakes are much more scarce. Included on archive number 1 are the following: Going Out to Get You, Shepherd, Passity, and Let Us Now Make Love. Going Out to Get You exists as a demo, while the remaining 3 tracks were recorded as part of a BBC live session. An interesting factoid about Going Out to Get You is that it was rearranged for the Nursery Crime Tour and subsequently re-recorded. However, this recording was never released. It was intended as a single to be backed with a completely lost song that we have no recordings of whatsoever, but that is another piece we will get back to later. You may have noticed that this is only 4 songs, not nearly enough to make up a full second record for Trespass. Thankfully, Anthony Phillips has in the past shed a bit more light on the cut material in interviews. He has mentioned Everywhere Is Here, Little Leaf, Grandma, and Moss as pieces that were performed live but never recorded, although Phillips himself would later rearrange Little Leaf as an instrumental called Old Wives' Tale, which he released as part of his Private Parts and Pieces series of solo albums. There was also a piece called The Movement, which at one point was around half an hour long, but was later whittled down to the 8 minutes of stagnation heard on the final album. Finally, Archive No. 1 features a demo of Dusk, which includes an extended outro and some nice harmony work at the beginning, but I did not count this as a distinct unreleased entry since it's still referred to as Dusk, and unlike Visions of Angels, released on the album it was intended to. With these new tracks, we can see an alternate version of Trespass might have looked something like this. Given the average length of tracks from this era, let's just assume the missing tracks were all about 5 minutes. We'll also leave out Visions of Angels since it's been included on the revised version of the previous album. Although Trespass is far more aligned with the Gabriel era Genesis than From Genesis to Revelation was, it still possesses something of a more folksy quality than those later albums do. And based on the tracks that Phillips later recorded, I suspect the inclusion of this additional material would have pushed things even further in that direction. Unfortunately, we are still only at 21 songs out of 37, and it is at this point in my search that I had to start getting creative. With official demos now exhausted, the next logical step was to go searching online for early live material. Live recordings from the Trespass era are incredibly scarce, and as such most of the songs I'm about to discuss are totally lost. If any of these lost songs are ever found, they would probably be the holy grail of early Genesis material. That being said, although the recordings are gone, if recordings ever even existed in the first place, their names still remain. By some miracle, we actually have a handwritten setlist of Genesis' first ever paid gig. This show appears to be one of the only times songs from Genesis to Revelation were ever played live, and also featured a number of tracks that were never recorded. The tracks that we have not discussed thus far are as follows: Masochistic Man, Cobham Chords, Digby of the Rambling Lake, Stranger, and Babies. Like with Little Leaf, Stranger was also re-recorded by Anthony Phillips at a much later date. Alongside these new songs, they also played 4 covers, which I choose to count because at this point in the search I was running out of places to look. We have Key to Love by John Mayall and the Blues Breakers, Black Sheep by SRC, Sitting on Top of the World by the Mississippi Sheiks, and The Stumble by Freddie King. As one final note for this set list, a song simply referred to as Movement is listed here alongside all the other songs mentioned. It is not clear if this is the movement, as mentioned earlier, as some sources mention another obscure early Genesis song that includes the word movement in its title, but I've chosen not to include it for now and will mark it as the third song today that warrants further discussion. We're really getting in the weeds now, but scouring random Genesis setlists on setlist.fm reveals a couple other songs that were played live only like once that we could potentially include on this list, such as Jamaican Longboat, I've Been Traveling All Night Long, which was supposedly a very early version of Can Utility and the Coastliners from Foxtrot, and The Light, which later became Lily White Lilith, and was the only song during the Peter Gabriel era written primarily by Phil Collins. 4 songs left, but thankfully there's one final untapped source of Phillips era Genesis that we can pull from that houses exactly 4 songs, the Jackson Tapes. The Jackson Tapes were 4 songs recorded as a soundtrack to an unreleased documentary about a painter named Mick Jackson, although I could have sworn I saw sources before that said the guy was named Michael Jackson, but then I couldn't find them again, but that would have been funny. Anyway. The songs were not released on either archive set, but rather as a part of a bonus disc in the later Genesis 1970 to 1975 box set containing the 2007 remixes of the Gabriel era albums. 3 of the tracks, Provocation, Frustration, and Manipulation, were more or less directly reworked into later tracks, with Frustration being an almost beat-for-beat pre-creation of Anyway from The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, just with different lyrics. Meanwhile, Provocation became the Fountain of Salmacis, and Manipulation became the Musical Box, both from Nursery Crime, although those tracks both had some sections added and others culled for the final arrangement. The last track, Resignation, does not seem to heavily resemble any later released Genesis track. Some Genesis fans have suggested that Resignation is actually a lifted section from the movement, but as far as I can tell, this is purely speculation. So there you have it, the 37 unused tracks from 1969 to 1970 that the Iceberg chart mentioned. At least, that's what I thought. Instead, it was to be that just as I had exhausted what I assumed were all my possible sources, I found more songs? Rael's Prog Rock Documentaries is a YouTube channel that used to mash up outtakes and solo songs from 70s prog rock bands to compose entire alternate albums, and has since graduated to making mini documentaries about prog rock albums. In Rael's video on Nursery Crime is this list of songs that had been performed or rehearsed in the time leading up to the Nursery Crime sessions. I was stunned. Some of these titles were ones I hadn't encountered anywhere else in my search. There were no sources in the description, so I can only assume these songs had been mentioned offhandedly in some interview or interviews that had since been inadvertently buried. Of the songs I didn't recognize were Classic, Eastern Magic Boogie, In the Meanwhile, Think Again, Wandering Water Lily, a different song just called Water Lily, Winter Flies By, and Silver Song, which Anthony Phillips later recorded for his solo debut. The list also included Wooden Mask, which is the name of the aforementioned lost B-side to the unreleased Going Out to Get You single, which I knew about but didn't include in my list of 37 because it was indisputably not of the Trespass era, unlike The Light, which was a bit more debatable in terms of time frame. In any case, I suddenly had 8 new songs to consider, which left me completely lost, because it wasn't enough to totally eliminate all the songs I thought were debatable, but too many just to swap a couple obviously wrong ones out. When I initially planned out this video, I had thus decided to keep my original list of 37 as is and then mention these extra ones as a side note, but then, as I was taking a break from the project, it happened. By yet another seemingly improbable miracle, the original poster had come back to the Genesis subreddit with an updated version of the Iceberg chart 5 years later. This poster had remained active on Reddit throughout the years, so I had actually left a comment on the original post when I started making this video, but as was expected for a post so old, I received no response. Now was my chance to finally get proper clarification. I left a comment, and 4 days later I got the final list. The actual 37 unused Genesis songs from 1969 to 1970. The list is as follows. Listen on 5, Don't Want You Back, From the Bottom of a Well, Barnaby's Adventure, Lost in a Drawer, From Shapes to Shadows, 14 Years Too Long, I'm Here, 2:30 Park AM PM, There Was a Movement, Visions of Angels, Everywhere Is Here, A Place to Call My Own, You've Gotta Be Perfect, Humanity, Wandering, Winter Flies By, The Movement, Stranger, Little Leaf, Eastern Magic Boogie, Digby of the Rambling Lake, Masochistic Man, Cobham Chords, Classic, Babies, Grandma, Silver Song, Epic, Think Again, In the Meanwhile, The Beggar and the Thief, Water Lily, Jamaican Longboat, I've Been Traveling All Night Long, Wooden Mask, and Moss. There are some obvious differences between the list I deduced and the actual list. First and foremost, the OP did not count any of the tracks released on Archive No. 1 as unused, eliminating a solid chunk of my list. The Jackson tapes and some of the other songs the band redid later were also not included. What was I right about then? The Lost Trespass era songs mainly, as well as some of the extra songs found during my time browsing setlist.fm, and most of the songs from the Rael video. Most surprisingly though, there were songs from even that video that I had missed. A lot of them. I had no idea where these came from. I didn't want to be so annoying as to ask about each individual song, but I did reply with a follow-up asking about general sources. The main ones cited were the aforementioned setlist from their first paid gig, as well as interviews with Anthony Phillips and the liner notes from Archive No. 1, which are not as easily accessible as the demos on it are. If the OP ever stumbles upon this video and wants to provide further clarification in the comments, I would greatly appreciate it. But as it stands, I'll just take them at their word and would like to thank them for providing the initial spark for this video, even if my own results ended up being way off the mark. While we're still talking about this list though, there are a couple of entries I'd like to give notes on. First, A Place to Call My Own 5-minute version was actually a separate entry on the original Iceberg chart and refers to a version of From Genesis to Revelation's closing track that had an extended outro. I'm not totally sure what the source for this is, but based on how the song goes, I believe it, since the 2-minute version we ended up with is kind of unsubstantial and just fades out unceremoniously. From a production perspective, I can almost understand why it was trimmed, since I can't imagine anything that goes for upward of 5 minutes would match the style of the rest of the album, but it did come at the cost of severely kneecapping the song. Second, as I mentioned earlier, There Was a Movement might be the other Genesis song using the word movement that the track title Movement on the setlist from their first live show might have been referring to. But either way, we don't really have any details on what that song might have sounded like. Third, in the reply to my comment asking for the list of the 37 songs, the OP mentioned that, like a few of the other songs we discussed, Anthony Phillips also recorded The Beggar and the Thief later on as a solo artist. And, finally, I find it a little funny that Wooden Mask was included on this list, but not The Light, since they're from the same era and were likely written around the same time, but we do have a single recording of the band performing The Light live, which isn't true of many of the other songs, so maybe that's why. Even accounting for the redundancies, when combining the actual list of 37 with my assumed list, we have well over 40 Genesis songs that have no real available recordings. Have a crack at that one, Lost Media Wiki. Although we have answered the question posed at the start of the video, the title of this video isn't 37 Missing Genesis Songs from 1969 to 1970. The title is Lost and Obscure Genesis Songs. Thus, to avoid accusations of clickbait for only talking about songs from an era of Genesis only the most hardcore of fans really care about, I'd like to use the rest of this video's runtime to discuss the B-sides and small handful of unreleased Genesis songs from the rest of their career, and use them to construct a sort of alternate discography for the band. That's right, this video is another discography dive in disguise, just like the Frank Zappa video before it. Let's get into it. Nursery Crime is a bit of an odd one to reconfigure because we only have one actual studio recording of a non-album track from the era, that being Happy the Man, which was released as a single and played a couple of times on tour. That being said, we do have bootleg recordings of two other tracks that were mentioned earlier, the rearranged Going Out to Get You and The Light. Seeing as how it was already included on our updated Trespass, Going Out to Get You might have to stay off the album for the sake of keeping things down to a single disc, but we can certainly add The Light. For the purposes of this exercise, I would prefer not to factor in the extensive list of songs from Rael's video that we have no info on besides the title, but I will make an exception for Wooden Mask, because it was explicitly intended for release alongside the Going Out to Get You single. Nursery Crime is Genesis' shortest album by far, so with a little bit of rearranging, we can easily tack on these 3 tracks without having to cut anything else. Here's what that album might have looked like. It's worth noting, both for this album and the rest of the video, that Genesis' single albums often went well over the recommended 48-minute maximum length for a vinyl record, with the peak being Duke at nearly 55 minutes long. So although the sound quality may suffer, I'm actually going to set that as the length cap for a single disc of these alternative albums. Nursery Crime is an interesting exception for Genesis in the opposite way that Trespass was. Although Phillips was gone, Tony Banks hadn't quite stepped in to fill the dominant sonic space that he had left, so we actually get Genesis' grittiest, most electric guitar-centric album here. I'm also a big fan of all the shorter tracks on the album, which is unusual for a progressive rock album where the epics usually get all the focus. I especially love the harmonies on both the Pastoral Harlequin and the comedic Harold the Barrel. Did you know that the latter was occasionally performed as an encore on the Selling England tour? It's such an underrated track. Unlike Nursery Crime, Foxtrot is rich with unused and later repurposed material. During the Foxtrot sessions, Tony Banks submitted early versions of both Firth of Fifth and A Trick of the Tail to the band. Steve Hackett presented his Shadow of the Hierophant, and the band collectively revived Twilight Alehouse from the Phillips era, which was later released as the B-side to I Know What I Like. Why any of these songs were rejected from the album is beyond me, as Firth of Fifth in particular is such a sterling song that I can't imagine it being bad in any incarnation. And Shadow of the Hierophant is maybe the most Genesis-sounding solo song of all the Genesis-sounding solo songs. Even if they weren't in their complete form yet, can you imagine a Genesis album that had Water of the Skies, Firth of Fifth, and Supper's Ready on it? That's a nearly perfect 3-track prog album, even not accounting for all the other songs still on Foxtrot. But I digress. All that is to say that like From Genesis to Revelation and Trespass before it, Foxtrot easily could have been a double. Here's what that album would have looked like. We'll leave off Twilight Alehouse since we included it on our version of From Genesis to Revelation, but the rest can stay. Incidentally, another item on the aforementioned Iceberg chart indicates that A Trick of the Tail, though it was presented to the band around the time of Foxtrot, was actually written around the time of the band's debut. The more you know. Even without these additional tracks, Foxtrot is still a stellar listen. Obviously, its opener and closer draw more of the focus, and rightfully so, but even deep cuts Get 'Em Up by Friday and Can Utility and the Coastliners have fun with different musical movements. The only track on the album that I would say is on the weaker side is Timetable, which even then at least has a memorable chorus. Selling England by the Pound has 2 unused songs. The first and more prominent one is a piece known as Deja Vu, written by Peter Gabriel and Steve Hackett. We know this because Steve Hackett finally re-recorded the song as part of his Genesis Revisited series. In my personal opinion, Deja Vu doesn't sound particularly like a Genesis song, but that might just be a quirk of the way Hackett arranged it, so who's to say? The second song, titled Compression, is one I only learned about partway through the writing of this video. Not having been fully developed for Selling England, Mike Rutherford brought the composition to the studio for his solo debut, Small Creeps Day, only to not put it on that album either. Poor Compression. That's not all for Selling England though, as while we may not have any additional unused tracks, there was some discussion among the band of cutting After the Ordeal entirely and trimming down the cinema show. This might be sacrilege to say, but I honestly would have been in favor of this. Selling England is traditionally hailed as the band's best, and it certainly houses some of their finest moments, but I do feel it is a bit bloated. Tracks like After the Ordeal and More Fool Me never really did grow on me like the so-called filler tracks on Nursery Crime did. That being said, since we moved Firth of Fifth over to Foxtrot, we don't really have a need to trim anything else for space, so After the Ordeal and the full Cinema Show can stay. This works out, because Cinema Show was originally intended to be joined with Dancing with the Moonlit Night for a 20-minute medley. Though the band ditched it to avoid comparisons to Supper's Ready, which is not the last time in their career they would do this, and side note, I really don't understand why they were so insistent on not doing another side-long medley, because, plenty of prog bands have done multiple, and they all sound distinct. It's not like being 20 minutes makes it exactly like Supper's Ready, but I guess I'm not getting anywhere critiquing the decisions of a band that were made 50 years ago, so... Anyway. Swapping out Firth of Fifth for Deja Vu and Compression and moving a couple songs to the A-side of the album to fill in the space, here's what the final thing ends up looking like. Also, I don't know where else in the segment to stick this, but Selling England is the first Genesis album where the production actually sounds good, as opposed to slightly muddy on the last couple albums, and downright amateurish on their debut. Yay! The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway has a total of 0 unused songs that could be swapped in for final tracks. The closest would be the Evil Jam, the live versions of The Waiting Room that featured heavy improvisations and by the end of the tour grew to around 9 minutes long, but even then it's ultimately still just The Waiting Room. This then raises the opposite question that is asked of nearly all double albums. What would a single LP version look like? It's kind of a difficult case with The Lamb, because the story places such an emphasis on symbolism over hard plot that trimming it down to just the songs that move the story forward would actually remove a lot of the album's best musical moments. Here's my best attempt at bringing The Lamb down to a single LP, although to be honest, I really do think a double is the best format for it. While it's true that the first disc of the album is probably more consistent on the whole than the second, I think the second disc has enough value and serves well enough as a climax to the story that to jettison it entirely would be folly. Notice how this single LP is a full 55 minutes and still just barely covers the most important plot beats and still leaves out a bunch of really cool musical moments, riding the scree you will be missed. To be clear, The Lamb is my favorite Genesis album. I think the sort of elusive mysticism it has going on is actually a strength, as you attain best results by allowing the imagery to wash over you. I acknowledge that it's an unconventional way of telling a story, though. Reconfiguring a trick of the tale is easy enough. There's only one used song, It's Yourself, which was originally planned to be a medley with Los Endos, and as it happens, we took exactly one song, that being the title track, and used it earlier on Foxtrot, so we can slot the new song right in. A fun fact about It's Yourself is that it has been released twice, and neither release was the complete recording, which we still don't have, although some clever fans have stitched the two versions together with Los Endos to come up with a decent approximation of what the whole thing might have sounded like. The lack of extra tracks is fine though, because it's not like Trick needs much in the way of restructuring. As it stands, the album is a really good sampling of what Genesis as a band has to offer. Dance on a Volcano and Squonk are the rockier tracks, Entangled, Madman Moon, and Ripples are more cerebral, ballad-adjacent tracks. Robbery, Assault, and Battery is the more comedic story song. The now excised title track is Genesis exercising their burgeoning pop-rock muscle, and Los Endos is the thematic closer. Ripples also might just be Steve Hackett's best guitar work on any Genesis track. The instrumental bridge is just mwah. If it weren't for the fact that it's a Collins-fronted album, I would heartily recommend it as anyone's intro to Genesis. That's not to say I have an issue with the Collins era, as you'll soon come to see, just that I think people ought to start with the Gabriel era. A Trick of the Tail is just as strong as any of the Gabriel era albums. Our reconfigured version may need a new name, lacking its title track, but that can be someone else's issue. Unlike the last couple albums, Wind and Wuthering had enough leftover material to have potentially made up a second disc. Of course, all 3 songs on the Spot the Pigeon EP originated from these sessions, as well as Steve Hackett's Please Don't Touch, which was rejected from the album and ultimately resulted in his leaving the band. The song they chose to include over it is famously Walk Gorilla, an instrumental reprise of One for the Vine, which played only 2 songs earlier. In retrospect, What Gorilla of all songs seems like an incredibly silly song to stake your lead guitarist over, but I suppose they couldn't have known it would play out like that at the time. As an aside, though we aren't counting Genesis's live medleys as unreleased songs, one fun fact about Walk Gorilla is that the only time it was played live was in a medley with Lily White Lilith and The Waiting Room, which is an insane pairing of some already niche Genesis songs, but it actually works kind of well. I almost considered including this live medley on the Double Wind album, but we already included the light on Nursery Crime, so I digress. I have also seen it suggested online that Hoping Love Will Last, another song ultimately included on Hackett's Please Don't Touch solo album, was suggested to the band. There seems to be some more debate over whether or not this particular tune was rehearsed, but for the sake of filling out this double, we can include it. Wind was originally one of my least favorite Genesis albums, but I've since come around on it, even on Your Own Special Way. Ironically, the one song from this album that I still have some cognitive dissonance with is All in a Mouse's Night. Usually I love the silly story songs, but a song that's literally about Tom and Jerry is where I cross the line. It somehow comes all the way back around to being pretentious. Still, I probably wouldn't say that Wind and Wuthering is Genesis at their A-game, it being the weaker of the 2 4-piece albums by quite a large margin. Their stabs at pop and jazz rock here are admirable, but they're still in the experimental phase. On Trick, Genesis presented a very polished and confident progressive rock sound. The double LP Foxtrot would have been an album for the ages, but Foxtrot is already a great album. This is the first album where I wonder if adding back the cut tracks would have pushed it from being a good album to a great album. Certainly, I'm a fan of all the songs on the EP. Inside and Out in particular is a fan favorite. Adding back the Hackett tracks would have also helped satiate him in this hypothetical alternate timeline. And then there were 3 as more of a typical case for Genesis in terms of cut songs. The Day the Light Went Out and Vancouver were both B-sides, the latter of which foreshadowed the lyrical themes of Phil Collins' first divorce as they were discussed on Duke and Face Value. And From the Undertow was a cut intro to Undertow, obvious, that was moved to A Curious Feeling, Tony Banks' first solo album. I'm not sure that these additional tracks would have changed the overall experience of the album much though. And then there were 3 Has Its moments, but it is definitely the sound of a band trying to relocate their direction. Every other Genesis album has its own distinct flavor to it, but then there were 3 sounds firmly like the middle ground between Wind and Duke. It doesn't necessarily stick out in my mind as a cohesive whole, even though I like a good handful of the tracks on offer. Also, even though it's only 3 new tracks, since And Then There Were 3 is already 53 minutes, it would have to be a double by necessity. It's just not a very exciting reason to make it a double, which is why I didn't mention it at the start. It's a similar situation with Duke, which we will discuss right now. Of all of Genesis' cut songs, the ones from Duke are probably the most notorious. First and foremost, there's the Duke Suite, which was originally a suite that the band broke up to once again avoid Supper's Ready comparisons, although it had the added benefit of giving the album a more clear closer. Then of course there is Phil Collins' solo hit from around the same time, In the Air Tonight. As the story goes, Phil claims he showed all the material from his first solo album to the band before going off to record the rejects on his own, and Tony claims he'd never been shown the song. Here's my thing. Whether Phil Collins actually showed In the Air Tonight or Genesis or not before recording it, it doesn't sound very much like a Genesis song. Genesis had a lot of stylistic range, but one thing they never were was sparse, and In the Air Tonight is an incredibly sparse song. Can you imagine Tony Banks' big piano chords over In the Air Tonight? Because I can't. They would ruin the song, and I say this while holding Tony Banks in the utmost regard. The 2 solo Collins compositions that ended up on the album work because they're songs that had room for big arrangements. But of course, we're not talking about my opinion here. We're talking about what was rejected during the sessions, and if you go by Phil Collins' story, In the Air Tonight was one such song. Add that, alongside the 2 B-sides from the Duke era, Open Door and Evidence of Autumn, and you end up with 1 additional solo composition from each member on this revised album. Also, let's put the Duke Suite back in order, because why not? Duke as an album is kind of in a lose-lose situation, because if you break up the suite, it loses some of its momentum as a complete piece, but if you leave it in place, it kind of disrupts the album's flow. I respect Mike Rutherford for making his 2 solo compositions in line with the general concept of heartache and loneliness that the Suite and Collins contributions have going on. Banks was off just doing his own thing, I guess, making the album as a whole very much feel like a concept album. That being said, I feel like Duke has always been missing something as a proper album experience. Even though the band compositions and the solo compositions share a theme, they never quite come together. I know that's kind of vague, but it's the only way I can explain the reason that I don't often think of Duke as in the upper echelons of Genesis albums, even though I like all the songs on it. Maybe it has to do with the pacing of the suite, I don't know. For Abacab, I don't even have to do any work, because it was explicitly intended to be a double album originally. As with most other scrap Genesis album tracks, the leftover songs ended up on an EP and some B-sides. Of particular note is the final broken up Genesis suite, consisting of Submarine, Dodo, Lurker, and Nami Nanu. The first and last pieces aren't particularly compelling on their own, but I do think they're pretty cool in the context of this suite. Plus, the complete suite is only like 10 minutes long, not even close to the 20 minutes of Supper's Ready, so I'm really not sure what the concern was with this one. The complete suite definitely would have been stronger than a couple of the songs included on Abacab. I used to consider Abacab my favorite of Genesis' post-Steve Hackett output, but it has since fallen in my personal rankings. A lot of the songs just kind of feel like they're missing something. The verses of Keep It Dark are boring, the title track and Me and Sarah Jane both go on for like 2 minutes too long, etc. This is the second Genesis album that I think would have really benefited from having the extra material, since it would have at least emphasized the grab bag stylistic exploration that drove the writing process behind this album, and thus would have given it more of a conceptual identity. No reply at all rules, though. Unusually, Genesis' self-titled album actually had 0 unique B-sides. Archive number 2 came out with a demo of Mama that runs a couple minutes longer, but I don't really think that qualifies. The closest thing self-titled has to an unused track is A Call to Arms, which Mike Rutherford developed into a track for Mike and the Mechanics' debut album after picking it out from a rejected jam from the self-titled sessions. We can slide that one on pretty easily. Self-titled is such a lopsided album because the A-side is just great the whole way through, and then the B-side is so mid. Illegal Alien is straight up racist. Just a job to do and taking it all too hard feel underdeveloped, and It's Gonna Get Better and Silver Rainbow have yet to really stick with me at all. I'm not sure how much adding this one song would fix that, but it's a decent track at the very least. Invisible Touch serves as a return to form for Genesis with 3 B-sides: Feeding the Fire, I'd Rather Be You, and Do the Neurotic. Invisible Touch is a normal-length 45-minute album, which makes it pretty short for a Genesis album, meaning we can just tack these B-sides on wherever we like, and wait, what do you mean Do the Neurotic is 7 minutes long? And Feeding the Fire is 6? Fine, I guess this one is a double 2. It's also probably worth noting that archive number 2 includes extended dance remixes of Invisible Touch, Tonight, 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 and Land of Confusion, but I wouldn't really consider those their own distinct tracks. While we're talking about Invisible Touch, I'd also like to take a moment to dispel a common misconception. People like to separate Genesis into prog and pop eras, but if you ask me, Genesis never stopped being a prog band. Certainly, starting with Duke, they put more emphasis on the pop song structure, but they infused that structure with progressive stylings and never stopped experimenting. I think it's telling that their so-called sellout album is the first in Selling England by the Pound to have a song over 10 minutes long that isn't split into multiple tracks. We Can't Dance then ups the ante by including 2 10-minute tracks. Speaking of, We Can't Dance is kind of a funny case because we have the 2 usual B-sides, Hearts on Fire and On the Shoreline, but then it seems there were a couple of other songs that came out of the sessions that didn't even make it that far. In the revised Iceberg thread mentioned at the end of the previous segment, the OP mentions a documentary, No Admittance, which features the working titles of songs known as Stones and When a Man, and implies the existence of a third unused song. This makes for 5 rejected songs total. We Can't Dance is only around 70 minutes long, which for a double LP leaves them about 20 more minutes of space to work with, more than enough to fit these remaining tracks on. Like with all double LPs, there is a crowd who thinks it should have been pared down to a single LP. At first, this seems like a pretty easy task. Take the concert staples, Jesus He Knows Me, No Son of Mine, I Can't Dance, and Hold on My Heart, and mix them with the 3 proggier songs, Dreaming While You Sleep, Driving the Last Spike, and Fading Lights, to get you a cool 48-minute album. But then you start to run into issues. Way of the World and Living Forever were both rehearsed for the We Can't Dance tour, bootlegs exist, which implies the band liked them at least a decent amount. Should they be included? What about Never a Time and Tell Me Why? Most people, myself included, don't love those songs, but they were released as singles. Suddenly, Since I Lost You is the only song left to cut. I do think there is perhaps a bit more merit to trimming down We Can't Dance than The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, if only for the fact that The Lamb has a concept and We Can't Dance does not, but for what it's worth, I think it's kind of poetic that both Gabriel and Collins' tenures with Genesis ended with double albums, the only doubles of Genesis' career. Oh, also like with the 3 songs on Invisible Touch, I Can't Dance also has an extended mix on Archive 2. I really don't know why they did these things, but they do exist. Funnily enough, continuing in this pattern is both the beginning and ending of Ray Wilson's stint with Genesis. Calling All Stations is a 3-side album. Not a triple album, a 3-side album. I have the record, there is an etching on the 4th side. The funny part is that they almost definitely could have filled out that 4th side if they wanted to, because I'm not kidding, Calling All Stations has the greatest number of leftover tracks since Trespass. Unironically, it might have been enough to make up an entire second album, albeit a much shorter one. Anyway, the names of all the unreleased tracks are Papa He Said, Banjo Man, Fret, 7/8, Anything Now, Sign Your Life Away, Run Out of Time, and Nowhere Else to Turn. The fun thing about Nowhere Else to Turn is that it was never even released officially, only on a promotional CD for the album. At least there are bootlegs of it out there online. I almost wish they did make a follow-up album out of these tracks, not because I like Calling All Stations, but just to help legitimize Ray Wilson's membership a little more instead of allowing his tenure to feel like this weird curio afterthought in the Genesis discography. Hiring both Daryl Strumer and Chester Thompson as full-time members also would have helped to give this era a big bump and a little more of its own identity, I think. For how long Chester Thompson played live with Genesis, the official members sure seem to love giving him specifically the short end of the stick. Thus, instead of tacking these tracks onto the end of Calling All Stations like we did with the other albums, let's just imagine this one as its own album with a new quintet formation for the band. Following the conclusion of our discussion on Calling All Stations, we have now gone over every non-Genesis album cut I am personally aware of. Although it is still possible I missed a handful of songs that were repurposed for members' later solo careers. If you know of any songs I left out here, let me know in the comments below. I tried to be as comprehensive as possible. I hope this video has made those who were previously unaware more interested in checking Genesis out, and exposed those who are already fans to a potentially different side of the band.